The deerskin pouch felt impossibly heavy in her small, dirt-caked hands. For 4 months, 12-year-old Clara May Sullivan had known nothing but the weight of silence and the ache of solitary labor on a farm the world had abandoned. She had moved rocks, dug swales, and spoken only to the wind, her grief a hard, silent stone in her chest. Now, an old woman with eyes as deep and knowing as the forest stood before her, offering not pity, but partnership in the form of heirloom seeds. As Clara's fingers traced the worn leather, a tremor ran through her, a crack in the dam she had so carefully built around her heart. The first tear was hot, a shock against her cold skin, followed by another, and then a torrent. She fell to her knees in the soft bed of clover she had cultivated from dust, and for the first time since her parents died, she cried. It was not the sound of sorrow, but the shattering, ragged sound of a soul that had just been told it was no longer alone. A single act of kindness can sometimes feel like the first rain after a decade of drought. It's a reminder that even in the most desolate places, life finds a way to continue. If stories like this resonate with you, and you believe in the power of human connection, take a moment to let us know where you are listening from in the comments below. By liking this story and subscribing to the channel, you join a community that appreciates narratives that dig a little deeper into the soil of the human experience. Your support ensures these journeys continue, and I promise you, this is a story of resilience you will want to see through to the very end. It's a testament to the strength found in the quietest corners of the world, a strength we often forget exists until we are reminded by the courage of someone like Clara. But to understand the immense weight of those tears, to feel the profound relief that a simple pouch of seeds could bring to a grieving child, we must travel back 4 months. We must go back to a cold, sterile office where hope was a foreign currency and her future was being appraised like a piece of broken furniture. This story doesn't begin in a field of green clover, but in a place of profound loss, just 2 weeks after the world as Clara knew it had been violently torn apart. It begins on November 5, 1929, in the office of the Cumberland County Sheriff, where a man with a predatory smile was explaining to a newly orphaned girl why her entire inheritance, her past and her future, was worth less than $100. Her world had been reduced to a state of profound and echoing silence. For 14 days, Clara May Sullivan existed in a borrowed room in Sheriff Miller's house, a temporary holding cell between one life and the next. The house smelled of stale coffee and damp wool, sounds muffled by a pervasive sense of adult anxiety she could feel but not comprehend. At 12 years old, she was an object of pity, a problem to be solved, a piece of sad local news that would soon be forgotten. Grief was not a storm of tears for her, it was a vacuum. The vibrant sounds of her home, her father's thoughtful humming as he read, her mother's soft singing as she worked in the garden, had been replaced by the quiet, heavy footsteps of the sheriff's wife and the constant, low crackle of the radio reporting on a world that no longer seemed to include her. She moved through those days like a ghost, eating meals she couldn't taste and sleeping in a bed that wasn't hers. The shock had built a wall of glass between her and the world. She could see people moving, their mouths forming words of comfort, but she couldn't feel any of it. Her mind kept replaying the last normal morning, the smell of pancakes, and the sight of her parents packing a small picnic for their train journey to Nashville. They were attending a botanical conference, a trip filled with the promise of new ideas and lively debate. Her father, Dr. Robert Sullivan, had kissed her forehead, his beard scratching her skin, and promised to bring back a book on mycorrhizal fungi. Her mother, Eleanor, had hugged her tight, smelling of lavender and fresh soil, and told her to mind the house. It was the last time she would ever feel their touch. The Sullivans had always been seen as peculiar by the people of Providence Creek. Her father was a former university professor who had abandoned academia to test his theories on a piece of land everyone else considered worthless. Her mother was a trained nurse who preferred herbal remedies and the wisdom of the earth to sterile clinics. They spoke of things like nitrogen fixation and companion planting, with a passion their neighbors reserved for Sunday sermons or crop prices. To the town, they were harmless eccentrics, intellectuals playing at being farmers. Their 60-acre inheritance, left to them by Clara's grandparents, was viewed not as an opportunity but as a folly, a testament to their disconnection from the practical realities of farming in the hardscrabble hills of Tennessee. This perception of her parents as failures now hung over Clara like a shroud. With them gone, she was not just an orphan, she was the heir to their perceived foolishness. The community's sympathy was tinged with a sense of inevitability, as if this tragic end was the logical conclusion to a life lived against the grain. Sheriff Miller was a kind man, but he was overwhelmed, a small-town lawman suddenly responsible for the future of a child whose entire support system had vanished in an instant. He saw her inheritance not as a legacy, but as a legal complication, another file to be processed, another sad duty in a job already full of them. The land was a liability, and Clara, by extension, was becoming one too. The summons to the sheriff's office came on a Tuesday morning, the sky the color of slate. The air was cold and carried the sharp scent of burning leaves, a smell that would forever be linked in her mind to the end of her childhood. Sheriff Miller explained the situation with a heavy sigh, his words careful and slow. A man from the bank, a Mr. Pemberton, was coming to discuss the disposition of her parents' property. The word disposition felt cold and clinical, like a doctor's term for a body no longer living. Clara put on her coat, her hands fumbling with the buttons, feeling impossibly small as she walked beside the sheriff down the main street toward the brick courthouse, each step taking her further from the life she knew and deeper into a world of contracts and consequences. The office was a cramped space, dominated by a large scarred oak desk and the imposing figure of a man who introduced himself as Silas Pemberton. He was dressed in a dark, perfectly pressed suit, his shoes so polished they reflected the dim light from the single window. He was the president of the Cumberland County Bank, and he carried with him an aura of absolute certainty, the kind of unshakable confidence that comes from always holding the winning hand. His smile was a brief, practiced motion that did not reach his eyes. Those eyes, small and sharp, assessed Clara not as a grieving child, but as the final piece in a simple transaction. He exuded a predatory patience, the quiet stillness of a spider waiting for the fly to exhaust itself in the web. He began to speak in a voice that was both smooth and condescending, laying out the facts as he saw them. He described the Sullivan farm with a surgeon's detachment, calling it 60 acres of eroded gullies and depleted topsoil. He spoke of a farmhouse with a leaking roof and a barn on the verge of collapse, painting a picture of utter desolation. He carefully explained that the property carried a burden of back taxes, an obligation she, as a minor, could not possibly meet. His words were designed to dismantle any sentimental attachment she might have, to methodically strip the land of any value beyond the raw numbers on a ledger. He was not just describing a piece of property, he was systematically erasing the memory of her parents' dream, dismissing their life's work as a failed and worthless endeavor. Then came the offer, presented not as a business proposal, but as an act of profound charity. He would, he said, absorb the back taxes himself. In exchange for the deed to the land, he was prepared to give her $100. He called it a fresh start, a small nest egg to carry with her to the next stage of her life. The sum was an insult, so meager it was meant to underscore the land's worthlessness. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost paternal tone, as if he were letting her in on a secret for her own good. He was, he implied, saving her from the burden of her parents' failure, offering her a clean escape from a place of ruin and bad memories. And beneath the veneer of generosity lay the unspoken threat, the cold steel of his true intentions. He spoke of the state's arrangements for children in her situation, casually mentioning the state orphanage as her inevitable destination. The choice he was offering was not between keeping her land and selling it. It was between walking away with $100 or walking away with nothing. He had cornered her, using her grief and her powerlessness as leverage. He was certain she would accept. In his world, a helpless, orphaned girl had no other move to make. He was simply tidying up a loose end, acquiring a forgotten piece of land for a pittance before the state machinery swallowed her whole. But in that moment of absolute vulnerability, something inside Clara shifted. As Pemberton's predatory smile widened, she didn't just see the banker in his expensive suit. She saw the faces of every person who had ever called her parents fools. She heard the dismissive tone of academics, who had laughed at her father's research. And then, cutting through the noise, she heard her father's voice, clear as a bell, from a memory just a year prior. They had been standing on the highest ridge of the farm, looking down at a scarred red clay gully. Her father had knelt, scooping up a handful of dry earth. He told her that the world saw this as dead, but it wasn't. It was only sleeping, and it would awaken for those who knew how to call its name. She looked directly into Silas Pemberton's eyes, the eyes of a man who saw only dead earth and profit. The wall of shock that had encased her for 2 weeks finally cracked, not with grief, but with a surge of pure, defiant purpose. She was the only person left in the world who knew the truth of that land. She was the only one who held the key to her parents' research, the notebooks filled with the secrets to waking the sleeping earth. To sell it for $100 would not just be a transaction. It would be a betrayal of everything they were, everything they had believed in. In the cold, dusty office, surrounded by the crushing weight of adult authority, 12-year-old Clara May Sullivan found her voice. It was quiet, it was trembling, but it was unwavering. She refused his offer. Pemberton's smile did not falter. It simply tightened, a subtle shift of facial muscles that transformed his expression, from one of condescending charity to one of cold, victorious patience. He did not argue or attempt to persuade her further. He simply rose from his chair, the fine wool of his suit making a soft, expensive sound in the quiet room. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Sheriff Miller, a gesture that was not one of respect but of dismissal, the acknowledgement of a tool that had served its purpose. As he walked out of the office, the confident click of his polished shoes on the wooden floorboards echoed with a chilling finality. He had not lost a negotiation. He had merely initiated a different, more inevitable process. Clara felt a cold wave wash over her, the terrifying realization that her defiance had not been a victory, but merely a delay of the unavoidable. She had refused to walk through the door he had opened, so now he would simply let the walls close in around her. The walk back to the sheriff's house was steeped in a heavy, unspoken dread. The November air, which had smelled of wood smoke and freedom just an hour before, now seemed thin and suffocating. Sheriff Miller walked beside her, his usual lumbering gait now a deliberate, heavy plod. He kept his eyes fixed on the dusty street ahead, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was charged with meaning. Clara could feel the shift in his presence. The weary kindness he had shown her for the past 2 weeks had evaporated, replaced by the grim resignation of a man forced to carry out an order he disliked. She was no longer a child to be comforted, but a problem to be managed, a piece of official business that was nearing its conclusion. Every step they took felt like a march toward a sentence that had already been passed down. The atmosphere inside the house confirmed her fears. The sheriff's wife, a woman who had previously fussed over her with warm meals and knitted shawls, now moved with a quiet, almost furtive efficiency. She avoided Clara's gaze, her movements focused on small, meaningless tasks in the kitchen. The familiar scent of baking bread was absent, replaced by the bland, institutional smell of potatoes boiling on the stove. The house, which had served as a fragile, temporary shelter from the storm of her grief, now felt like a cage. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, once a comforting rhythm, now sounded like a countdown. She was an outsider, a temporary guest whose welcome had officially expired. The unspoken message was clear. Her time here was over, and her next destination would not be a place of warmth or welcome. That evening, after a dinner eaten in near-total silence, Sheriff Miller called her into the small, cramped room he used as a home office. The space was filled with the scent of old paper and stale pipe tobacco. Maps of Cumberland County, crisscrossed with faded pencil lines, were tacked to the walls. A tall, black telephone sat silently on the corner of his desk, a direct line to a world of rules and regulations that she could not comprehend. He motioned for her to sit in the hard-backed wooden chair opposite him, the one usually reserved for people in trouble. He didn't sit immediately, instead pacing for a moment behind his desk, his shadow looming large in the dim lamplight. He finally sat down with a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire county, folded his hands on a stack of official-looking papers, and looked at her with eyes full of a weary pity that was far more terrifying than Pemberton's open greed. He began to speak, his voice low and devoid of emotion, the carefully rehearsed tone of a man delivering bad news. He explained that since she had refused Mr. Pemberton's offer, the county had been forced to proceed with the standard protocol for orphaned minors without legal guardians. He used cold official words like ward of the state and disposition, the same word Pemberton had used. He explained that her case had been reviewed by a circuit judge that very afternoon. He paused, taking a deep breath before delivering the final, crushing blow. The state had made its determination. She was to be transferred to the Tennessee State Orphanage and Industrial School just outside of Nashville. The name itself sounded like a prison, a place where children were not raised but processed, their individuality stripped away and replaced with a number and a uniform. The threat was no longer a vague shadow, it was a concrete, unchangeable fact, with a terrifyingly close deadline. The sheriff explained that the paperwork had already been signed and filed. It was final. There was no appeal, no one to petition, no other option to consider. A state social worker would be arriving in Providence Creek on the morning train that Friday. He said the date as if it were any other day, November 8th. For Clara, the date burned itself into her mind. It was 3 days away. 72 hours. Her entire world, her entire future, had been condensed into that small, suffocating window of time. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and heavy. The sound of the ticking clock from the hall grew louder, each tick a hammer blow marking the seconds of her remaining freedom disappearing one by one. He went on to explain the cruel logic of the system, his words a clumsy attempt to justify the indefensible. He told her the county simply didn't have the resources to care for her, especially with times getting harder. He admitted that Silas Pemberton was an influential man, the head of the bank that held the mortgages for half the farms in the county. After her public refusal, no local family would dare cross him by taking her in, especially when she was tied to what everyone considered a worthless piece of land. He was trying to make her understand that his hands were tied, that he was just a small cog in a large, unfeeling machine. But what Clara heard was a confirmation of her complete and utter powerlessness. The entire world of adults had conspired, through greed or indifference, to erase her. To make the verdict absolute, he slid a document across the desk. It was a letter typed on official state letterhead, bearing a dark blue embossed seal. Her eyes scanned the page, catching phrases like legal custody, state guardianship, and immediate transfer. And there, in the middle of a paragraph of dense legal text, was her own name, Clara May Sullivan. Seeing it printed there, on that cold, impersonal document, made it irrevocably real. It was a death warrant for the person she was. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the paper. It felt smooth and cold, like a gravestone. This piece of paper had more power over her life than she did. It had the power to sever her last connection to her parents, to her home, and to the very earth they had loved. The numbness that had protected her since her parents' death finally receded, replaced not by tears, but by a surge of ice-cold terror. She saw the orphanage in her mind, a stark brick building filled with rows of identical iron beds, a place her father had once described as a warehouse for forgotten children. He had told her stories of how such institutions were designed to break a child's spirit, to train them for a life of factory work or domestic service, extinguishing any spark of creativity or independent thought. The threat wasn't just about losing her freedom, it was about the systematic destruction of her soul. They intended to take the daughter of Robert and Eleanor Sullivan and turn her into another anonymous, compliant cog in the great grinding machine of the state. As if to add one final, cruel twist, the sheriff leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He told her that Mr. Pemberton, in what the banker was calling a final act of Christian charity, had agreed to keep his offer of $100 open until Thursday evening. The sheriff presented it as her only chance to have something, anything to her name, before she was taken away. He thought he was offering her a small comfort, a final bit of agency, but all Clara could see was the perfect, inescapable design of the trap. Pemberton hadn't needed her to say yes in his office. He just needed the system to do his work for him. He would get the land for free, and her $100 would be the price of her silence, a final, humiliating payment for her own erasure. She stood up from the chair, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She walked out of the office without a word, leaving the sheriff sitting alone with his papers and his pity. The sounds of the house, the clatter of a dish in the kitchen, the low murmur of the radio in the parlor seemed to come from a great distance. Her world had narrowed to a single desperate point of focus. The threat was absolute. The timeline was non-negotiable. There was no help to be found in this town, no kindness left to appeal to. As she stood in the dark hallway, she looked through the front window, past the street lights of Providence Creek, and out into the blackness of the countryside. She could not see it, but she knew it was out there, 7 miles away. The ruined farm, the dead land, the one place on earth that was still hers. And in that moment of total desperation, an impossible, terrifying idea began to take root. It was not a plan for survival. It was a plan for escape. The decision was not born of logic or careful consideration. It was an instinct, a primal rejection of the cage that was being built around her. Standing in the dim hallway of the sheriff's house, the cold of the window pane seeping into her forehead, Clara understood with a sudden terrifying clarity that there was no adult who could or would save her. The world of rules, of papers, and of powerful men like Silas Pemberton was a river current pulling her toward a destination she could not survive. Her refusal in his office had not been a victory. It had been the first act of a war she was now fighting alone. The darkness outside was no longer just an absence of light, it was a canvas, and on it, her mind projected the only alternative she had left, the 7-mile walk to the one place on earth that still carried her name. The farm was not an inheritance of land, it was an inheritance of a fight, and in that moment, she chose to take it up. For the next 48 hours, Clara May Sullivan became a student of shadows and silence. She moved through the sheriff's house with a newfound purpose, her grief now a tightly coiled spring of resolve. Her mind, once clouded by shock, was now a sharp, analytical tool. She observed the rhythms of the small household, mapping them in her memory. Sheriff Miller left every morning at precisely 6:30, his old Ford sputtering to life in the crisp morning air. His wife would then spend the next hour in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans and the smell of coffee providing a consistent auditory cover. The front door was rarely used, but the back porch door, leading out past the woodpile, had a latch that barely caught. This was her window, a small gap in the routine of the world that was trying to contain her, and she knew she had to be ready to slip through it before it closed forever. Fear was a constant, cold companion during those 2 days. It settled in her stomach every time the sheriff's wife looked at her with pitying eyes, and it tightened her chest at night when the house grew quiet and the enormity of her plan pressed down on her. The image of the orphanage, a grey, faceless building filled with the ghosts of forgotten children, was a powerful motivator, but it was the memory of her father's voice that gave her the strength to push the fear away. She could hear him as clearly as if he was standing beside her, explaining that the most resilient forms of life were not the largest, but the ones that could adapt to the harshest conditions. He had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the act of moving forward despite it. She was his daughter. She was Eleanor's daughter. She would not be warehoused, she would adapt, she would survive. Her preparations were conducted in stolen moments, in the quiet solitude of her borrowed room. The first item was her small, worn suitcase, which she packed with a methodical quietness that belied the frantic beating of her heart. She chose her sturdiest clothes and her father's old work boots, which were 2 sizes too big, but thick-soled and waterproof. Every movement was a risk, a floorboard creaking too loudly, a drawer sticking and then giving way with a sudden noise. Any small sound could draw unwanted attention and unravel her fragile plan. She packed by the slivers of moonlight that cut through the thin curtains, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision. This small collection of fabric and leather was all that remained of her old life, and it felt impossibly light, a testament to how little she had left to lose. The second, and far more important object of her preparation was the heavy cardboard box stored under her bed. It did not contain clothes or keepsakes, but the sum of her parents' lives, their research, Dozens of spiral-bound notebooks filled with elegant handwriting, complex diagrams, and pressed botanical samples. Lifting the box was a physical and emotional effort. It smelled of dry paper, ink, and faintly of the rich soil her mother used to handle. This was not just a collection of data. It was her only map, her only guide for the impossible journey ahead. It contained the secrets of the sleeping Earth. As she carefully slid the box out from under the bed and placed it beside the suitcase near the door, she felt a profound sense of responsibility. She was not just escaping for herself, she was escaping to protect this legacy, to prove that her parents' dream was not a folly, but a truth the world had not yet been ready to see. The timeline was absolute, a relentless countdown that echoed in her mind with every tick of the hall clock. The train would arrive Friday morning. The social worker would be on it. Therefore, her escape had to happen before the sun rose on Friday. Thursday became a day of unbearable tension. She ate her meals in silence, forcing down food that tasted like ash, her mind rehearsing every step of her plan. She would leave at 5 in the morning. The 7-mile journey would take her hours on foot, especially carrying her burdens. She calculated that if she could leave the town behind before anyone was awake, she could be on the dirt road leading to the farm by sunrise, making her much harder to find. The plan was terrifyingly simple, a straight line drawn from a cage to a wasteland, and its success depended entirely on her ability to become invisible. That final night, sleep was an impossibility. She lay in the strange bed, fully clothed except for her oversized boots, and listened to the house settle around her. Every groan of the old structure, every distant bark of a dog, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. This was the point of no return. Once she opened that door and stepped out into the pre-dawn cold, there was no coming back. There would be no more borrowed rooms, no more meals cooked by another's hands. There would only be what she could do for herself. She thought of her mother's hands, how they could calm a fever or coax a seedling from the earth. She thought of her father's quiet determination, the way he would work on a problem for weeks until he found a solution. She was made of them both. As the darkness in the room began to soften into the deep grey of earliest morning, she knew she was ready. The sound she was waiting for came exactly on schedule. The low rumbling cough of Sheriff Miller's Ford engine turning over was her signal. It was the sound of her jailer departing, the sound of her window of opportunity opening. She didn't hesitate. Swinging her legs over the side of the bed, she pulled on the heavy boots, her fingers fumbling with the laces in the dark. She stood, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird, one suitcase in her left hand, the heavy box of notebooks cradled in her right arm. Each step across the wooden floor was a calculated risk, a breath held until her foot was safely down. She reached the door of her room, slowly turned the cold brass knob, and pulled it open, the latch clicking with a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. The house was a sleeping beast, its breaths the slow, deep groans of old wood settling in the cold. Clara May Sullivan moved through its belly, a ghost in oversized boots. She reached the back porch, her hand closing over the cold iron of the latch. Lifting it felt like an act of impossible strength, each inch a victory against the silence. When it finally cleared the catch, she pulled the door open just enough to slip through, the frigid November air hitting her face like a physical blow. It smelled of frost and damp earth, the scent of a world that was indifferent to her fate. She stepped onto the wooden planks of the porch, a small, burdened figure under a starless sky, the weight of the suitcase in one hand and the box of her parents' entire world in the other, pulling her down toward the frozen ground. The escape had begun, and with that first step into the biting cold, she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Her first obstacle was the backyard, a landscape of treacherous, familiar shadows. The frozen grass crunched loudly under her two large boots, each step a potential alarm in the profound quiet of 5 in the morning. She moved with a strange, shuffling gait, trying to walk on the balls of her feet to soften the sound, a technique her father had once taught her for moving quietly through the woods. Her arms screamed from the awkward weight of her luggage, the cardboard corner of the box digging painfully into her ribs. She kept her eyes fixed on the dark windows of the sheriff's house, expecting a light to flare on at any moment, expecting a voice to call out and end her desperate bid for freedom. Reaching the low wooden gate at the edge of the property, she fumbled with the simple latch, her fingers numb and clumsy. The hinges let out a long, piercing squeal that made her freeze, her heart leaping into her throat. She waited, every muscle tensed, listening for any sign that she had been discovered. The only sound was the faint, high whistle of the wind, moving through the bare branches of the oak trees lining the street. After a full minute that felt like an hour, she pushed the gate open the rest of the way and slipped into the narrow alley that ran behind the houses. Here, the darkness was almost total, a comforting blanket that also hid unseen dangers. The alley smelled of cold wood smoke and decay. She moved slowly, one hand outstretched, feeling her way along the rough wood of a neighbor's fence. Her foot kicked something metallic that skittered across the frozen ground with a loud clatter. She froze again, her breath held tight in her chest, convinced she had woken the entire town. It was just an old can, but in the amplified silence of her escape, it sounded as loud as a church bell. At the end of the alley, she peered cautiously around the corner onto the main road that led out of town. Providence Creek was a collection of dark, silent shapes, but her relief was short-lived. Across the street, a single yellow light glowed in the downstairs window of the baker's house. Someone was awake. The sight paralyzed her. She shrank back into the shadows of the alley, her back pressed against the cold brick of the last building. She couldn't risk crossing the open street with that light on. She would be a perfect silhouette. So she waited, the suitcase and box becoming instruments of torture, their weight a crushing physical manifestation of her impossible task. Her breath plumed in front of her face in ragged white clouds, and she watched the window, praying for the darkness to return, each second stretching into an eternity of cold and fear. Suddenly, the light went out. The house across the street was plunged back into darkness. This was her chance. She didn't hesitate, forcing her aching muscles into motion. She scurried across the road, a desperate, clumsy crab walk, her head on a swivel. The oversized boots, a source of warmth, were now a liability. The heel of one caught on an uneven paving stone and her ankle twisted. She pitched forward, a small cry escaping her lips as she fought for balance. For a horrifying second, she thought she would fall, that the box of notebooks would smash open on the hard ground, her parents' legacy scattered to the wind. But instinct took over. She managed to right herself at the last moment, stumbling into the shadows on the other side of the street, her heart hammering against her ribs from the near disaster. She pressed on, keeping to the deep shadows cast by the silent storefronts. The town she had known her whole life now seemed alien and hostile. The large glass window of the general store reflected a distorted, ghostly image of a small girl struggling with her burdens. She looked like a refugee, a wanderer with no destination. The vulnerability of her situation was overwhelming. She was 12 years old, utterly alone, walking into a future that was a complete and terrifying unknown. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper her name, a phantom voice of pursuit. She resisted the urge to look back, forcing her eyes forward, focusing on the simple mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other. Survival had been reduced to this, one step, and then the next, and then the next. From a yard 2 houses down, a dog began to bark, a frantic high-pitched sound that shattered the pre-dawn stillness. Pure, undiluted panic seized her. She dove behind a large, empty rain barrel at the corner of the hardware store, crouching down, trying to make herself invisible. The barking was relentless, a furious announcement of her presence. She was certain a light would come on, that a door would be thrown open, that the sheriff would be called. She squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of her suitcase. Then she heard a muffled shout from inside the house, an angry command for the dog to be quiet. After a few more defiant yaps, the barking subsided, replaced once more by the whistling of the wind. It was a moment of sheer, dumb luck, a small reprieve from a universe that seemed determined to catch her. The physical cost of her flight was becoming unbearable. Her arms felt as if they were being pulled from their sockets, a searing, burning pain that radiated up into her shoulders and neck. The box of notebooks, which had seemed merely heavy in her room, now felt like it was filled with lead bricks. She had to stop, leaning against the cold brick wall of the bank, Pemberton's Bank, and awkwardly shift her loads. She set the suitcase down with a soft thud and tried to cradle the box differently, but there was no comfortable way to carry it. The cold was no longer just on the surface of her skin. It was a deep internal ache, a chill that had settled into her very bones. She was shivering uncontrollably, not just from fear but from the relentless, energy-sapping cold of the Tennessee morning. Finally, she saw it ahead, the end of the town. The last sputtering streetlight marked the boundary between the world of men and the dark, open country beyond. Reaching that pool of faint, lonely light felt like reaching the shore after a long and desperate swim. She paused for a moment beneath it, setting down her burdens and looking back at the dark cluster of buildings that was Providence Creek. It was the only home she had ever known, and she was leaving it behind forever. There was no sadness in the departure, only the grim relief of a prisoner who has just cleared the outer wall. She had made it through the first and most dangerous part of her journey. She was exposed, she was exhausted, but she was for the moment free. As if to remind her that her escape was far from over, the mournful whistle of a train echoed from miles down the valley. It was the 5:30 freight, a sound she had heard every morning of her life, but tonight it carried a new and terrifying meaning. It was a herald, a precursor to the other train, the one that would arrive in just a few hours, the one carrying the woman who would sign the papers and transport her to the state-run orphanage. The sound was a spur, a sharp reminder that time was her enemy. Standing still was not an option. Every minute she wasted was a minute closer to being caught. The temporary relief she had felt vanished, replaced by a renewed and desperate urgency. She had to keep moving. She picked up the box and the suitcase, the pain in her arms returning instantly, and stepped out from under the streetlight's glow, plunging into the deeper darkness of the country road. The world changed instantly. The ground beneath her feet was no longer paved, but a frozen, deeply rutted dirt track. The silence was different here, too, not the empty silence of a sleeping town, but the living silence of the wilderness, filled with the rustle of unseen things in the dry leaves and the sighing of the wind in the pines. Her eyes strained to adjust, to pick out the darker shapes of the ruts and rocks that threatened to trip her with every step. Her entire world narrowed to the few feet of treacherous ground directly in front of her, a path she could feel more than she could see. She walked for what felt like hours, a solitary moving speck in a vast dark landscape. She passed the old covered bridge over Miller's Creek, its familiar shape a skeletal silhouette against the faintly lightening sky. The gurgle of the cold black water below was the only sound besides her own ragged breathing and the crunch of her boots on the frozen earth. Here the loneliness was absolute. There were no houses, no lights, no sign of human life. It was just her and the immense, indifferent world. For a moment, the sheer scale of her undertaking threatened to overwhelm her. A wave of despair washed over her, the terrifying thought that she would not make it, that she would simply collapse here on this empty road. She clutched the box of notebooks tighter, the sharp cardboard edge pressing into her chest, and thought of her father's hands, how they were never idle, always building, always fixing. As the first hint of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, painting it a pale, bruised purple, she knew she had to rest. She found a large, flat rock at the side of the road, partially sheltered by a thicket of wild rhododendron, and carefully set down her burdens. The relief in her arms was so intense it was dizzying. She slumped onto the rock, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to conserve every last bit of body heat. She blew on her numb fingers, watching her breath turn to smoke in the frigid air. She had done it. She had escaped the town. The farm was still miles ahead, a destination that felt impossibly distant, but she was no longer running from something. For the first time, she felt like she was walking towards something. After only a few minutes, knowing she couldn't afford to let the cold stiffen her muscles, she forced herself back to her feet. She picked up the suitcase and the heavy box one last time. They were still a terrible weight, but something inside her had shifted. It was no longer the weight of despair, it was the weight of purpose. With the faint light of the coming day illuminating her path, she turned her back completely on the town she could no longer see and faced the open road. She was a small girl against a vast landscape, armed with nothing but a desperate plan and the collected wisdom of the two people who had believed that even dead Earth could be brought back to life. And so she walked on, each painful step a declaration of war against the world that had tried to erase her. The final mile was not a road but a a deeply rutted track that fought her with every step. The faint purple of dawn was now a bruised yellow, revealing the true state of the landscape she had only seen in her mind's eye. It was worse than Pemberton had described. The fields were not just fallow. They were wounded, scarred with deep, red clay gullies where the topsoil had bled away. The trees were skeletal, their bare branches clawing at a sky the color of dishwater. She finally reached a pair of leaning fence posts that marked the entrance to the property. A weathered wooden sign, half swallowed by wild briars, still bore the faded, hand-painted letters of her family name, Sullivan. Stepping past it felt less like a homecoming and more like entering a graveyard. This was her inheritance. This was her refuge. This was the battlefield she had chosen. The farmhouse stood on a small rise, silhouetted against the growing light. It sagged to one side as if exhausted from a long, losing fight with gravity. The paint had been scoured away by years of wind and rain, leaving the wood a silvery, splintered grey. The porch roof dipped precariously in the middle, and a single black window on the second floor stared back at her like a hollow eye socket. Every detail confirmed the banker's dismissive assessment, yet Clara felt no despair. A strange, fierce sense of possession rose in her. This ruin was hers. This decay was her starting point. She walked up the 3 broken steps onto the porch, the wood groaning under the weight of her oversized boots, and reached for the heavy iron door handle. This was not a shelter given. It was a fortress to be reclaimed from the inside out. The door protested, with a long, mournful shriek of rusted hinges, swinging inward to release a gust of air, thick with the smell of coal dust, mouse droppings, and the deep, damp scent of decay. The chill inside was a different kind of cold than the biting wind outside. It was a still, tomb-like cold that seemed to emanate from the very walls. She stepped across the threshold, her burden suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. With a gasp of effort, she set the suitcase and the cardboard box down on the floorboards. The relief was instantaneous and overwhelming. Her arms, which had been screaming with fire, now tingled with a pins and needles ache as blood rushed back into them. For a moment, she simply stood there in the entryway, breathing in the stale air of her new home, the only sound the frantic, desperate pounding of her own heart. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, revealing the main room of the house. It was a space of ghosts. The furniture, a sofa, 2 armchairs, a low table, was draped in white sheets, their forms made soft and indistinct in the dim light. Cobwebs, thick and intricate as lace, hung from the ceiling beams and connected the furniture in a delicate silver web of neglect. The great stone fireplace, the heart of the home where her family had spent so many winter evenings, was a black, gaping mouth filled with old, cold ash. The silence here was absolute, a heavy, pressing weight that seemed to absorb all sound. She was completely, utterly alone, a 12-year-old girl standing in the wreckage of her past, facing a future that was a vast and terrifying blank. Her first priority was not food or rest, but warmth. The cold had settled deep into her bones, and her shivering was now uncontrollable. She made her way to the kitchen, a smaller, darker room at the back of the house. There, against the far wall, was the old cast-iron cook stove, a beast of black metal and nickel plating, dulled by a fine layer of rust. It was her best hope. She ran a hand over its cold surface, her fingers coming away coated in grime. Beside it, tucked into a small alcove, was a sight that made her pause. A small, neat pile of kindling and a few split logs were stacked there, dry and ready. It was an anomaly, her single point of order, in a universe of chaos and neglect. It was too deliberate to be an accident, a small act of preparation left behind by someone, for some unknown future purpose. A flicker of desperate hope ignited in her chest. If there was wood, perhaps there was a way to light it. She remembered a small, decorative tin box her mother always kept on the mantelpiece above the main fireplace, a place for spare matches and buttons. Her legs felt heavy as she walked back into the main room, her eyes fixed on the dusty shelf. She reached up, her small fingers closing around the cold metal of the box. It was lighter than she expected. She lifted the lid, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, nestled in a bed of old cotton, was a full box of wooden safety matches, and beneath it something else, a small square of paper folded over and over into a tight, dense packet. It was not a button or a stray scrap, but a message, intentionally placed, waiting to be found. With fingers that were numb and trembling from both cold and anticipation, she carefully lifted the note out of the box. The paper was old and soft, the creases worn from years of being folded. She gently opened it, her heart hammering against her ribs. The handwriting was her mother's, the familiar, elegant script she had seen on countless recipes and letters. It wasn't a long, emotional farewell, but something far more potent. There were only 2 short sentences, written in dark, permanent ink. "For our little spark," it read, "just in case you ever need to start a fire on your own, we will always believe in your light." The words were a key, unlocking a part of her heart that had been frozen shut for weeks, for months, for an eternity. But the release was not a flood of tears. The hook in the story of her grief had not yet found its moment. The words did not break her. They forged her. They were not a comfort for the past, but a command for the future. Her parents had known somehow that this moment might come. They had left her not just a farm, but a tool, a message, and an expectation. The cold that racked her body was suddenly met by a different kind of heat, an internal fire of resolve that burned away the last vestiges of her fear. She was not just an orphan running from a cold world. She was the daughter of Robert and Eleanor Sullivan, and she was standing in the exact place she was meant to be. The note was not an epitaph. It was her first instruction. She walked back to the kitchen with a new purpose in her step. She slid one of the wooden matches from its box, its small red tip a tiny promise of defiance. The rough, striking strip on the side of the box felt coarse beneath her thumb. She took a deep, steadying breath, and then, with a single, decisive motion, she struck it. The match flared to life with a hiss and a puff of sulphurous smoke, the tiny flame a brilliant dancing star in the oppressive gloom. It was the first light in this house in years, a light she had made herself. She carefully touched the flame to the dry kindling in the belly of the iron stove. A thin curl of smoke rose, and then a small, hesitant flicker of orange caught at the edge of a piece of bark. The tiny flame wavered, threatened to die, and then, finding purchase, it grew. It licked at the kindling, crackling softly, pushing back the shadows and the profound, deathly cold. Clara May Sullivan stood before it, the empty matchbox still clutched in one hand, the folded note a warm, solid presence in her pocket. As the sun finally crested the ridge, sending weak, watery light through the grimy kitchen window, she looked out at the ruined land. The task ahead was still immense, perhaps impossible, but she was no longer alone. She had a box of her parents' knowledge, a fire she had started with her own hands, and the absolute certainty that they had believed in her light all along. This was not a wasteland. This was a promise, and the work was about to begin. The fusion of 2 distinct worlds of knowledge created a powerful synergy on the Sullivan farm. Clara's days were spent translating her father's scientific theories into tangible action, her hands deep in the soil he had only analyzed on paper. The notebooks were her guide, providing the precise language of chemistry and biology, explaining the intricate dance between soil microbes and plant roots. They were the blueprint for the farm's physical resurrection. But it was Opal Nightingale who breathed life into that blueprint. She brought with her the wisdom of generations, an intuitive understanding of the land that no book could ever capture. She taught Clara how to read the sky for rain, how to listen to the wind for signs of a coming frost, and how to feel the readiness of the soil, not with a testing kit, but with the palm of her hand. Together they were not just farming. They were healing a piece of the earth, weaving science and spirit into a single, resilient tapestry of green. Clara came to understand that her parents had not been trying to invent a new way of living, but rather to scientifically validate an ancient one. Her father's research on companion planting, which detailed how certain crops protect and nourish each other, was a perfect echo of Opal's stories about the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, which her people had planted together for centuries. The corn provided a stalk for the beans to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil for the other 2, and the broad leaves of the squash shaded the ground, preserving moisture and preventing weeds. It was a perfect, self-sustaining community, a lesson in cooperation that the world of men seemed to have forgotten. She realized her parents' legacy was not about being revolutionary, but about being reverent, about having the humility to listen to the earth and the wisdom of those who had come before. The farm transformed under their combined care. The first year was a battle for stability, a slow, painstaking process of building terraces and enriching the soil with compost and cover crops. The second year was a time of cautious optimism, as the first real harvest of vegetables proved that the land was waking from its long, exhausted sleep. By the third year, the summer of 1932, the Sullivan farm was no longer a ruin. It was an island of impossible abundance in a sea of regional despair. The Dust Bowl wines that scoured the plains to the west and the economic collapse that starved the cities seemed to stop at its borders. The fields were a vibrant patchwork of greens, the gullies had healed into gentle, grass-covered swales, and the small orchard they had planted near the house was heavy with the promise of its first fruit. It was a testament to a different kind of wealth, one measured not in dollars, but in life. It was on a sweltering afternoon in late July of that third year that the past returned, driving a cloud of dust up the newly restored lane. Silas Pemberton stepped out of a gleaming black automobile, his dark suit looking comically out of place against the backdrop of thriving green. He was older, thinner, and the practiced smile he wore seemed stretched tight over a foundation of desperation. The Great Depression had been unkind to men who dealt in paper promises. He did not come with an offer this time, but with a demand. In his hand, he held a foreclosure notice. A legal document he claimed was based on an old unpaid mortgage signed by Clara's grandparents. He spoke with the same condescending certainty as before, explaining that with the farm now clearly valuable, the bank was simply exercising its right to collect on a long overdue debt. The trap he had set 3 years ago was finally closing. For a moment, the world tilted under Clara's feet. The terror she had felt as a 12-year-old girl in the sheriff's office came rushing back, a cold, sickening wave of helplessness. All her work, all her belief, all the love she had poured into this land, it was all about to be swept away by a piece of paper, by a lie from a desperate man. She looked at the document in his hand, the official-looking stamps, and the dense legal text designed to intimidate and confuse. Pemberton's smile widened, sensing his victory. He believed he was facing the same powerless, isolated child he had tried to swindle years before. He had miscalculated. He was no longer dealing with a frightened orphan. He was facing a young woman who was standing beside her family. Opal Nightingale, who had been shelling beans on the porch, simply rose, wiped her hands on her apron, and invited Mr. Pemberton inside for a glass of cold water. The air in the small farmhouse parlor was thick with tension. Pemberton sat stiffly in one of the old armchairs, the foreclosure notice placed on the table between them like a weapon. Clara stood by the window, her heart pounding, watching as Opal calmly walked to a large carved wooden chest that sat in the corner of the room, a piece of furniture that had belonged to Clara's grandparents. The old woman knelt and lifted the heavy lid, releasing the faint scent of cedar and thyme. From beneath a pile of hand-stitched quilts, she retrieved a long, oilskin-wrapped parcel tied with twine. She placed it on the table next to Pemberton's document and slowly, deliberately began to unwrap it. The banker watched, a flicker of uncertainty finally crossing his face, the confident smirk beginning to falter. Inside the oilskin was a leather folio, its surface softened with age. Opal opened it, revealing a collection of papers preserved with meticulous care. She slid one across the table toward Pemberton. It was a bank receipt from the Cumberland County Bank, dated March 12, 1920. The document clearly stated, paid in full for the mortgage on the 60-acre Sullivan property. She then produced another, and another, a complete set of receipts and the original deed, clear and unencumbered, all signed by Pemberton's own predecessor. The farm had been owned outright for nearly a decade before her parents had even inherited it. The mortgage document Pemberton held was a complete and utter fabrication, a clumsy forgery created by a man hoping to prey on a child he assumed had no history and no protectors. Then Opal revealed the heart of the matter. Tucked inside the folio was a small envelope, yellowed with age. She handed it not to Pemberton but to Clara. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter written in her grandmother's strong, clear handwriting. It was addressed to Opal. It spoke of their deep friendship, and the trust they placed in her. Her grandmother wrote that she and her husband had a premonition, a deep unease about the kind of men who were beginning to take power in the world, men who saw land not as a living thing but as a number on a ledger. They were entrusting these papers to Opal, their dearest friend, as a final line of defense, a silent guardianship to protect the land for the generations that would follow them. They had seen the darkness coming, and they had prepared for it. Clara's hands trembled as she held the letter. The grandparents she barely remembered, the ones she knew only from faded photographs and her parents' stories, suddenly became real and present in the room with her. They had not been naive dreamers. They had been wise and fiercely protective, planting a seed of salvation with their trusted friend years before the threat had even taken root. They had foreseen a moment just like this one. They had known that the world could be a dangerous place for people like their son and his family, and they had taken steps to ensure their legacy would be safe. It was an act of profound, forward-thinking love, a message sent across time to a granddaughter they would never meet, telling her that she was not and had never been alone. The full weight of this revelation settled over her, a feeling of gratitude so immense it left no room for air. She looked at Opal, whose quiet, steady presence had been a constant source of strength, and now understood that the old woman had been more than a friend or a mentor. She had been a guardian, a silent keeper of a promise made a decade earlier. She had carried the weight of this responsibility, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. This was the ultimate proof of her parents' worldview, that the strongest bonds are not written on legal papers, but are woven through trust, community, and a shared love for the earth. Her family had not just been a small unit of 3. It had been a wider circle of care, a network of resilience that had just saved her entire world. Pemberton's face had drained of all color. The exposure of his fraud was absolute and undeniable. He sat silently for a long moment, the architect of his own ruin, staring at the proof of a goodness and foresight he could not comprehend. He eventually stood, gathered his false document, and walked out of the farmhouse without another word. He did not look back. His departure was not a victory march, but the retreat of a defeated predator, a shadow banished by the light of a long-held truth. As the sound of his car engine faded down the lane, a profound silence filled the room, a quiet space for the enormity of what had just happened to finally settle. Clara was safe. The farm was safe. The future was hers. She walked over to the wooden chest and looked down at the quilts, the faint scent of cedar filling her senses. She ran her hand over the intricate stitching, a pattern of leaves and vines her grandmother had made. Every object in this house, every tree outside, every handful of soil was imbued with a new layer of meaning. It was not just her parents' legacy she was protecting. It was her grandparents as well. It was a chain of love and resilience passed down through generations. She was a link in that chain. The tears that finally came were not the hot, ragged tears of a lonely child, but the quiet, steady tears of a young woman who had just been handed the story of her own strength, a story that had begun long before she was ever born. This was the true inheritance. It was not the 60 acres of land, but the unshakable knowledge that she belonged to a lineage of people who fought for what they believed in, who protected what they loved, and who trusted in the goodness of others. The farm was more than just a place to live. It was a living monument to that belief. Every terrace she had built, every seed she had planted, had been an act of faith, and that faith had just been rewarded in the most profound way imaginable. She was not just the keeper of the land, she was the keeper of their story, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would spend the rest of her life honoring it, ensuring that the light her family had nurtured would never again be threatened by the darkness. The exposure of Silas Pemberton's fraud sent ripples far beyond the Sullivan farm. A state investigation was launched, uncovering a systemic pattern of predatory lending and forged documents that had dispossessed a dozen other families across the county. Armed with the truth and with Clara's story as a catalyst, those families fought back. Land was restored, debts were forgiven, and a measure of justice was brought to a community that had been bled dry by one man's greed. Clara's quiet, solitary stand had become a movement, a powerful reminder that even the most deeply entrenched systems of power can be challenged by the simple, unwavering truth. She had not sought to be a hero, But in defending her own small corner of the world, she had helped to save a piece of everyone else's. In the aftermath, the legalities of her own life were finally settled. With no other family to claim her, and with a bond that had been forged in soil and spirit, Clara was formally and joyfully adopted by Opal Nightingale. She was no longer a ward of the state, or an orphan adrift in the world. She was a daughter again. The farmhouse, once a symbol of ruin and solitude, became a true home, filled with the warmth of 2 generations of wisdom, the smell of baking bread, and the quiet rhythm of a life lived in harmony with the seasons. She had a family, she had a home, and she had a purpose that was as deep and rich as the dark, healthy soil she now cultivated. Clara May Sullivan Nightingale spent the rest of her long and fruitful life on that farm. She never left. She married the son of one of the very families she had helped save from Pemberton's scheme, a young man who understood the value of the land not as a commodity, but as a sacred trust. Together they raised 4 children, teaching them the science from their grandfather's notebooks and the wisdom from their great-grandmother Opal's stories. The farm became a beacon in the community, a place where neighbors came to learn about crop rotation and water conservation, a living classroom demonstrating that it was possible to thrive even in the harshest of times by working with the land instead of against it. She never sought fame or recognition for her work. Her name was not written in history books or academic journals. Her legacy was written in the land itself. It was in the dark, fertile topsoil she had built from red clay and compost. It was in the clean, clear water that ran in the creek, filtered by the healthy ecosystem she had restored. It was in the faces of the children and grandchildren who grew up strong and healthy, nourished by the food that came from her fields. Her life was a quiet, powerful testament to the truth her father had taught her so many years before, a truth she had proven with her own 2 hands. Years later, as an old woman with hands as wrinkled and knowing as Opal's had once been, she would often walk to the highest ridge of the farm at sunset. She would look out over the lush terraced fields, the thriving orchard, and the sturdy farmhouse nestled among the trees. She would feel the cool evening breeze, a gentle whisper carrying the scent of clover and rich earth. In those moments, she felt the presence of all of them, her parents, her grandparents, and Opal, not as ghosts of the past, but as a living part of the land itself. The earth, she knew, never truly dies. It only sleeps. And it awakens, vibrant and full of life, for those who have the courage and the love to call its name.